When Rome won, their women lost everything. The horror history tried to hide you. Hear the sound first, not battle drums or victory horns, but something quieter, more human. The shuffle of bare feet on stone, the rattle of iron chains. Then you see her, face streaked with dirt, silk gown torn at the shoulders, wrists bound so tightly the metal has drawn blood. Yesterday, ambassadors bowed when she entered a room. Today, 10,000 Roman voices scream her name like a curse. She keeps her eyes on the ground, not from shame, but because, if she looks up, she'll see her daughter walking 3 steps behind her, and that will break her completely. This is not a scene from the battlefield. The war is already over. What you're witnessing is something Rome did better than any empire in history, turning survival itself into a weapon more brutal than any sword. Before we go deeper, I'd love to know, are you watching this from Rome itself? From somewhere that was once part of this empire? It amazes me how a horror from 2,000 years ago still echoes across every continent today. This is Rome, 167 BCE. The general Lucius Aemilius Paulus has just crushed the last Macedonian king, Perseus, at the Battle of Pydna. The legions are already home. The soldiers are spending their plunder. But the victory parade, the triumph, hasn't happened yet. Because for Rome, conquest wasn't complete until the enemy's family was paraded through the streets like livestock. The Senate has archived everything: who walked, in what order, what they wore, how the crowd reacted. These weren't just celebrations. They were state-sanctioned psychological warfare, designed not to kill, but to erase. And the wives and daughters of defeated kings? They weren't prisoners of war. They were living monuments to Roman dominance, kept alive specifically so their suffering could be seen. Here's what the archives don't tell you, but the Greek historian Plutarch hints at. Some of these women tried to prepare. They practiced walking in chains. They coached their children not to cry, because they knew once you entered Rome's gates as a captive, your body was no longer yours. Your face belonged to the crowd. Your tears were entertainment. And if you died, you'd die as a spectacle, not a person. The day of the triumph, the Queen of Macedon, whose name has been lost, like so many others, wakes in a cell beneath the Circus Maximus. She's been held here for 3 months, long enough for her wounds to heal, long enough for her to look presentable, but not so long that anyone forgets what she represents. A slave brings water, bread, and something unexpected: a comb. The cruelty of that gesture is extraordinary. They want her to look like a queen just long enough for the humiliation to register. She braids her daughter's hair in silence. The girl is 9 years old. Yesterday, she asked when they could go home. The procession begins at the Campus Martius. First come the carts loaded with Macedonian gold, shields, crowns, statues of gods melted down into Roman coin. Then the paintings, massive canvases depicting Perseus's defeat, his retreat, his capture. The crowd loves this part. It's like watching a movie of your enemy's destruction, frame by frame. Then the sacrificial oxen, white and garlanded, led toward the temples. Then the musicians. Then the soldiers, chanting, drunk, some still wearing Macedonian helmets as jokes. And then silence. Because now comes the part everyone has been waiting for. Perseus walks first, in the chains he'll wear until he's strangled in the Tullianum prison 3 days from now. His sons walk beside him, too young to understand, old enough to remember. And behind them, separated by 10 paces of deliberate Roman choreography, walks his wife. She's not named in the official accounts. History recorded her presence, the way you'd note the weather. But here's what we know. She doesn't stumble, doesn't weep, doesn't beg. The Roman poet who watched wrote only this: she walked as though the street were still hers. That act of silent defiance, it may have sealed her fate. Because here's the thing about Roman cruelty that no one talks about. It wasn't random. It was strategic. When a queen died on the battlefield, she became a martyr. Songs were sung, legends grew. But when she survived, when she was married off to a Roman officer, or sold in a slave market, or forced to serve wine at the banquet celebrating her husband's death, she became a warning. And Rome needed warnings. They were building an empire that stretched from Britannia to Judea, and the only way to hold that much territory was to make rebellion unthinkable. So they didn't just conquer kings. They humiliated queens. They didn't just defeat armies. They erased bloodlines. Let's talk about what happened after the parade. Because this is where the horror gets quieter, more intimate, and somehow worse. The royal captives who survived the triumph faced 3 possible fates, and none of them involved freedom. Some were sold in Rome's slave markets auctions held in the Forum, where human beings were displayed like pottery. But these weren't ordinary slaves. A former queen had value. Wealthy Romans would pay extra for the novelty of having a deposed monarch serve their dinner parties. Imagine that, spending your life carrying wine to the same people who cheered as your husband was executed. Others were given as rewards. After a major victory, generals distributed land, gold, and women to their officers. A captain who'd served well might receive a Macedonian noblewoman as a bride, not a wife in any real sense, but a trophy with a pulse. She would bear his children, who would grow up Roman, worshipping Roman gods, speaking Latin, knowing nothing of their mother's language or people. This was how Rome conquered the future. They didn't need to kill every enemy. They just needed to make sure the next generation belonged to them. But the most insidious fate was political marriage. Rome understood something modern empires often forget. Controlling a woman's womb meant controlling a nation's future. So they married conquered princesses to allied kings or rival claimants or regional governors. These marriages were treaties written in flesh. Take Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony. After her parents' defeat, she was paraded through Rome as a 10-year-old, displayed like a hunting trophy. But Octavian didn't kill her. He kept her alive, educated her, and then married her to Juba II of Mauritania, a king who existed only because Rome allowed it. Her children would rule a client state, forever loyal to the empire. She lived in palaces, wore gold, commanded servants, and every single day she woke up knowing her survival was a tool in someone else's hand. The sources are fragmented, but one chilling detail survives in the letters of Cicero. He mentions, almost casually, that some noblewomen tried to take their own lives rather than face the triumph. But Rome had anticipated this. Captives were watched constantly in the days before the parade. Belts were removed, sharp objects confiscated. Even hairpins were taken. Because if a queen died by her own hand, she won. She escaped. And Rome couldn't allow that. They needed her alive, broken, and visible. Here's where the story takes a turn that feels almost mythological, except it's documented. Some women were forced into the arena, not as gladiators that came later, but as part of the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. During the games, between gladiator fights, the Romans would stage elaborate mythological plays using real prisoners. A captured queen might be dressed as Andromeda, chained to a post, and mauled by leopards while the crowd watched. The line between theater and execution dissolved. Her death became a performance, her screams part of the entertainment. The poet Martial describes one such scene, writing with genuine admiration at the realism. He never mentions her name, but not all the horror happened in public. Some of it was bureaucratic, recorded in neat columns on papyrus scrolls that archaeologists have found preserved in the dry sands of Egypt. Lists of captives, their ages, their skills, their purchase prices. One scroll, dated to 146 BCE, after the destruction of Carthage, records the sale of 37 women of noble birth, ages 12 to 44, literate in Greek, 37 lives reduced to inventory. What's haunting is the notation beside some names, suitable for household management or trained in music. These weren't just slaves. They were women who'd been educated, who'd had futures, who'd expected to marry kings and raise dynasties. Now they were being evaluated like horses. And here's a detail that should make your skin crawl. Rome kept some of these women as permanent hostages. They'd live in decent conditions, a villa, servants, even an allowance, but they could never leave. Their presence in Rome ensured their fathers or brothers back home wouldn't rebel. One rebellion, and the daughter dies. It was a hostage system that lasted generations. Some women lived their entire lives in this gilded captivity, dying old and gray in a city they'd learned to navigate but never to love, watching their children become Roman, forgetting the language of their mothers. The question that haunted Roman writers, and it did haunt some of them, you can see it in the later Stoic philosophers, was whether this was justice or atrocity. Seneca, writing centuries after the Macedonian triumph, called it victory's cruelest face. He knew what it cost, but he also knew it worked. The Germanic tribes saw what happened to Arminius's wife after his rebellion. The Britons saw Boudicca's daughters. The Jews saw the women of Jerusalem. Every culture that defied Rome learned the same lesson. Your women will pay the price. And that knowledge, that visceral inherited trauma, kept the empire stable for centuries. There's a moment Plutarch records that I can't stop thinking about. During one triumph, a captive queen, he doesn't say, which stops walking, just stops in the middle of the Via Sacra, with the entire parade behind her. The crowd goes quiet, the soldiers tense, and she looks up, for the first time since entering the city, and stares directly at the general in his golden chariot. She doesn't speak, doesn't move, just looks. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, she makes him see her. Really see her. Not as a trophy, but as a human being whose world he destroyed. Then the guards drag her forward, and the parade continues. But the poet who watched wrote that the general's smile faded, and didn't return for the rest of the day. That moment matters because it reveals something Rome tried desperately to hide. These women had power. Not physical power, not political power, but the power of witness. They remembered. They recorded in whispers, in stolen letters, in songs their daughters taught their granddaughters. And some of those memories survived. We have fragments, inscriptions, graffiti, notes in the margins of Roman histories written by Greeks who sympathized. One inscription, found in a villa in Pompeii, reads simply, "Here lived Arria of Carthage, who never forgot." That's all. But it's enough to know she existed, that she resisted in the only way left to her, by refusing to let Rome erase her name. The consequences rippled through centuries. Medieval European kings studied Roman triumphs and copied them. The Mongols adapted the hostage bride system. The Ottomans refined it. Every empire that came after learned from Rome that humiliation could be more powerful than execution, that survival could be weaponized, that a woman's body could be turned into a political statement. The playbook Rome wrote in the blood and tears of conquered queens became the standard text for empire building. Even the colonial powers of the 19th and 20th centuries used these same tactics, separating families, erasing cultures, forcing marriages to civilize and control. But here's what's strange. Rome itself eventually fell to the very forces it created. The barbarian kingdoms that carved up the Western Empire were led by men whose grandmothers had been Roman captives, who carried in their blood the memory of humiliation and the hunger for revenge. History is full of these ironies, but this one feels almost poetic. The empire that weaponized women's suffering was brought down, in part, by the sons and grandsons of those same women, who never forgot what Rome had done. There's an artifact in the British Museum, you can go see it right now if you're ever in London, that captures all of this in one small object. It's a ring, bronze, worn smooth, dated to around 150 BCE. Engraved on it, in Greek letters so tiny you need magnification to read them. Remember who you were. It was found in a mass grave of women outside Rome. Someone wore that ring every day. Someone needed that reminder, that whisper of identity, to survive. And when she died, she was buried with it, holding on to the last piece of herself that Rome couldn't take. The queen who walked through Rome in chains on that day, in 167 BCE, we don't know what happened to her. The historical record goes silent, but we know what happened to hundreds of others like her. And the pattern is clear. Some died quickly, their suffering measured in days. Others died slowly, their suffering measured in decades, watching their children forget, their languages disappear, their names become footnotes in Roman glory. The cruelest part? Rome didn't see this as evil. They saw it as statecraft, necessary, even honorable. Because in their minds, the alternative, letting an enemy's family survive with dignity, would mean weakness. And Rome could never afford to look weak. But history remembers differently than Rome intended. We remember the triumph as theater, yes, but as tragedy, not glory. We remember the queens not as trophies, but as human beings who endured something we can barely imagine. And we remember that the empire, which seemed eternal, which conquered the known world, which turned human suffering into state policy, eventually crumbled into dust, while the stories of the women they tried to erase lived on in fragments, inscriptions, and whispers passed down through 2,000 years. You can still walk the Via Sacra today. It's mostly ruins now, stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Tourists take photos. Guides recite dates. But if you stand there quietly, at the right time of evening when the crowds thin out, you can almost hear it, that shuffle of bare feet on stone, the rattle of chains, the sound of a woman walking as though the street were still hers. And you realize Rome tried to turn her survival into a weapon. But in the end, it was her memory that became immortal. They built an empire on her humiliation. She built a haunting they could never escape.